And I'm Vipul Viyas, in case you're wondering how to pronounce the name. And today what I want to talk to you about is sort of where does clutter come from, what can we do about it, and how can we do or have less of it in our lives in general. So those are the basic things we want to cover. So I think most people want or aspire to have maybe a bathroom counter that looks something like this, right? This is the aspirational state from Dwell magazine or what have you. But more often it looks like this. And who here can relate to that? This is kind of what ends up happening. You have a lot of detritus, what we call today clutter, and it's an amalgam of different things we've tried, experimented with. And most of the stuff, as we talked about before, will end up in landfill. This counter is just a way station to some underground place for it to reside for the next 1,000 years. Very little of it will be recycled. So even the plastic you see here, only 6% in the US is recycled. Actually, Japan is much better at over 80%, but we only recycle about 6%. And the other thing to know about recycling is that plastic can only be recycled a certain number of times, about 5 to 10 times, before those fibers become difficult to recycle again. The same thing is true with paper and cardboard. The only infinitely recyclable materials are metal and glass, really. So silicone also not very recyclable, usually mostly turned into industrial lubricants. And that's rare, only certain municipalities bother to do that. So this is all stuff that is cluttering our minds, our space, and eventually the planet. So what is clutter? What is this clutter that we need to declutter? And this is not a bathroom countertop, but this is probably many people's garages. And clutter is, as the definition you guys can read here, is the collection of things lying about in an untidy mess. And what's interesting is that the word clutter has become more commonly used in our lexicon over the past 50 years as we've had more stuff to create clutter. So this chart at the bottom here is probably no surprise. I do wonder why that dip is happening there at the end. Maybe we got organized, or all the home organization services that have popped up because of the clutter have had an effect. I doubt it. But this is an interesting anecdote in terms of the word clutter itself has become more common based on what our physical space is likely starting to look like. So clutter creates stressful, burdensome, both financially and physiologically and psychologically, spaces that are also ineffective. Can you really find anything you need in that garage? I can't tell you how many times in my own cluttered world I bought the same thing 4 or 5 times. And then when I go on my archaeological dig, when I clean up, like, oh, I didn't know I had that. I actually found something that was expired 7 years ago in my pantry. So you don't want that kind of stuff to happen with any frequency. But it happens all too often in America. So why does clutter happen? If you guys have read the book Dopamine Nation, there's a great quote in there from a doctor who studies diabetes, which is, we are cacti in a rainforest. Meaning we're full of and surrounded by abundance that we neither need nor is good for us. It actually is detrimental to us, and we'll talk about the ways in which that is the case. But I love this term that we are cacti in a rainforest. So we're set up and evolved to only need so many things, yet we can drown in everything. And that is the age of abundance and modernity that has enabled that. It's good and bad. There's two sides of every coin. So what could be the social drivers of this? There are a few. One is that household incomes have increased since the turn of the last century. The other is that the expenditures have also increased. That's a function of things that are now available as we move from the farm to the city. And one of the other things that's not here is that the agrarian workforce went from 80% of the economy to less than 7% of the economy today. So we used to mostly make the stuff that we needed, including the food, clothing. We repaired our own stuff. That dissipated away. We'll see what AI does from a workforce reorganization perspective. But again, most people worked on, near, or for a farm around the turn of the last century, around 1900, 1890, 1900. And today, that number is 6%. So that is a massive shift in how we live. And as a function of that, what household expenditures were increased significantly because we were now trading time and our money from that time for things. And so that was another big driver. Also, the share of necessities went up for the same reason. We're now not growing food, we're buying it. So that's another reason that chart shows a up into the right rise, as all of these generally do. The other thing in the opposite direction is family sizes started to decrease. So you had more stuff and more spending for fewer people, which is a good thing. You could be resource rich from that perspective. And then the number of women in the workforce increased, so now you had dual incomes and more money coming into the household to buy more things, but also that meant that more conveniences and things of that nature were relevant. So you didn't have sort of split labor, and that's even more the case now than ever. And then finally, this is sort of a positive thing in terms of more parts of society enjoyed affluence as opposed to just maybe certain parts of society. So all this is driving wealth, essentially this whole point that we made before around the cacti and the rainforest is all driving this abundance and therefore excess or ability to buy things to a significant degree. Now, what could the personal drivers be beyond the social drivers? One is we have bigger homes, so there's just more space to put stuff in. The average American home is about increased in size about two and a half times since the 1950s alone. So the average home is now about 2,600 square feet. Maybe not always in Palo Alto, but in other areas of the country in aggregate, it's about 2,600 square feet. It was around 1,200 square feet 70-ish years ago. So that's a big change. So there's more space to put stuff in. And we have less time, or rather, but we have less time. And so that means we consume more and produce less. And we're trading our time for those objects, and often is often the case. And what the other factors we just talked about, there's more money, there are more options, there's increased shelf stability, and there's also a need and desire for novelty because it can be achieved. We can have novelty and sort of that dopamine hit of having something new on a regular basis. That McDonald's there is a decade old. I think you guys have seen things like this before, but that is impressively shelf stable. That McDonald's burger was purchased in 2011 and still looks like it might be edible at a stretch. So the other piece is that the act of buying itself becomes a pursuit. You can see here there's a scavenger hunt operated by Target. One of the things that after this talk, hopefully you'll note, and maybe you already do, is if you go into a Target or Walmart, and maybe you don't go there because you can't take it, but if you do, or Costco, one of the things to observe is that most everything in those big box stores, again, just like the counter, they're on a weigh station or they're at a weigh station to the landfill. Most of the stuff is unrecyclable plastic, things that may be used for a few minutes and then never used again and are headed to landfill. And if we're lucky, a recycling plant for 1 or 2 cycles at best, but it will ultimately end up in landfill or in our waterways and oceans and then in our ecology or lived environment and then eventually in us. And I think you guys probably have heard we did a separate talk a couple months ago on microplastics, but most of the stuff is now ending up inside us. Couple key facts just to sort of dwell on in terms of this notion of clutter and how it impacts our health more than just our lived space is that now almost every organ system in the body has microplastics present in it. About 0.5% of our brains now are made up of plastic. Arterial plaque is now increasingly made up of plastic because it doesn't disintegrate or biodegrade like natural substances. And so it just bioaccumulates along with other chemicals and substances. You probably have heard of things like forever chemicals, phthalates, BPA or bisphenols. All of these chemicals are used in the production of the plastic. So they're not necessarily plastic themselves. They're used to give plastic certain properties, transparency, pliability, rigidness, etc. In the case of forever chemicals or PFAS, it's used to give plastic extra slickness or waterproof characteristics. So all this stuff is coming inside us now. In that same period of time, just as a side note, that microplastic prevalence has increased. And one reason that it's increased is because we're producing 3 times more plastic now than we were even 20 years ago. And the reason for that is because a lot of the developed world is now online and living like we do with a lot of single-use plastic. So much more is being produced and put into the environment in our bodies. We can actually even find it in dolphin breath of all places. But in that same period of time, we know that plastic and those chemicals I enumerated just a moment ago, PFAS, bisphenols, phthalates, are all endocrine disruptors. And as a result, we've seen a 50% drop in free testosterone in males from 1970 to today.
Did you say 50%?
50%. It's been 25% since the year 2000. So it's a dramatic drop. Further, the other thing that we see is that general fertility and motility for men is down by about the same amount, 25% since 2000. The other unfortunate things are in around 2008, 2010, they were looking at umbilical cord tissue. They weren't finding much microplastic then. In 2012, about 10% of placenta had microplastic present, around 10%. And now, as of 2022, 100% of placenta have microplastics present in the placenta. And 100% of breast milk does as well. And now, 100% of baby's first poop has microplastic. This, a decade ago, was not the case. And it really is a function of the exponential growth in plastic production and consumption. One thing that really drove it to an accelerated degree in the last half decade or so is during the COVID pandemic, there was a decreased utilization of oil and gas. And so petroleum companies needed to find alternative uses for their product, for the raw material. And one of the things you may notice is, you guys are probably all old enough to remember that things at the supermarket were coming packaged in cardboard, like strawberries were in the little cardboard baskets and whatnot. Maybe there's a plastic little film over it, but it's mostly cardboard. That no longer exists. You basically go in the produce aisle and it's all plastic clamshells. And that is because the price of oil dropped, and so the cost of this packaging material, of plastic, clamshells, et cetera, also dropped and just became cheaper to use plastic. So plastic is now very pervasive. There's obviously a cost to that we've just discussed that is not calculated in the cost of production, but in the cost to our health. So we'd be happy to talk about that some more in a bit, but that's one thing to keep in mind. So as I said, most everything here, when you go to Target or Walmart or wherever next time you go, just look and say, this is all going to end up in the ground at some point. So what we buy is meant to be visually compelling, highly addictive, self-neglectful. We kind of ignore all the implications we probably do know about or are aware of in terms of health effects, et cetera. Financially extractive, generally speaking, and dubiously sustainable. So as we know, most packaging has a recycling symbol on it. The recycling symbol doesn't mean much. Most of the plastics that we actually use aren't recyclable. Only a certain percentage are. And that symbol is actually used more to indicate what type of plastic it is than anything else. I think most people may be aware of that, right? That the recycling symbol on plastic doesn't mean this is recyclable to any extent. And so those claims are fairly dubious. I think you guys are probably aware that most of the food, the consumer packaged goods, and specifically consumer packaged food in the US is produced by about a dozen or so companies. Most of those companies, about half actually, of those companies were acquired by big tobacco concerns in the 1980s as tobacco was becoming more regulated, so they needed a different source of revenue that was reliable, so a lot of them bought. Many of these food companies, for example, Philip Morris bought Kraft Heinz. You guys may be aware of that. And in doing so, one of the things that they did as a first move in their playbook was increase the addictive properties of the food, increase salt, fat, and sugar. And it was because this is something that worked in their core playbook around tobacco. And so Heinz ketchup, the formulation itself, for example, changed between 1980 and 1990. Now, that's why a lot of the food that we have has the content it does. That was not an accident. This was very conscious. And those same companies, Philip Morris, et cetera, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, this is all laid out, divested of most of these companies in around 2000 when they were facing state and federal lawsuits, and they didn't want to be implicated for two bad things. And so they disgorged themselves of the food companies. General Mills, Kraft Heinz, et cetera, Nabisco were all liquidated by big tobacco at that point. And so you might feel this is sort of, I have to do a Star Trek reference, it is Silicon Valley. Resistance is futile, but that is the notion that we're being marketed to. Anything you go in the grocery store and take a look at, everything is geared for you to consume this stuff, makes it easy to consume this stuff because it's cheap, it's shelf stable, and it practically screams at you from the shelf. That's actually the goal, for it to be very visually engaging. So when we bring this to our home, it looks like this. It's a cacophony, it's a mess, right? So we took all those little pieces and now they don't fit together as nicely as they did at the supermarket. And we have something that's visually stressful, highly dysfunctional, unhealthy, not sustainable. It's environmentally damaging for sure, and it's also financially wasteful. One of the things to note here is if you take a look at that picture, there's something called supermarket aisle syndrome. And what that is for people who suffer from migraines, you know, bright, if you know migraineurs, you know that bright light, smell of chocolate, smell of wine, red wine especially, will trigger migraines. It's because it's overly visually or sensory stimulating. Well, supermarket aisles do the same thing to people with migraine problems because they're so overwhelming in terms of stimuli. So it tells you probably what it does to us on a daily basis. This is not, this is disconcerting to our brains, whether we consciously realize it or not. So what are the implications? Less money, less mental health or increased stress and anxiety. Our general health is not great, and I'm living proof of that. And then a lot of waste, as we've talked about. So what do we do? The traditional approaches to decluttering, and we'll get into decluttering a bit more now, involve really going through and saying, what do you need and not need? And there's some things like, for example, approaches like Marie Kondo that'll say, what items give joy, what items don't give joy, and you kind of select things to go out of the home and stay in the home based on some criteria. So that's the edit portion typically that's engaged in. And then there's a categorization portion, which is let's put things that are alike together and group them in a bin or some kind of storage solution to put them all in one place. That also involves the containing part. Now that I know these are 5 different kinds of toothpaste I own, I want to put them in one container and so I can find them and then label it so that I can reference it more easily. This is the traditional approach to home organization and decluttering. So what's often missed is that 50 to 80% of the items in our home are either used once, rarely, or never. In fact, they say about 20% of the items in our home are never used. And we did an audit of a home in Los Altos where that was actually the case. We found things that were perfectly sealed. This was in the pantry, which would be less likely to think that's going to happen there. But we found Halloween candy from 2012. This was this year. So this is not uncommon. That's a function of things get sort of put in the back corners and then forgotten about. They end up in the recesses of the kitchen, and then only when someone moves or has a big spring cleaning do you find them. And so just like your banker's box of papers, you go on these archaeological digs, and the best part about them is you learn something about yourself. There's like a history lesson. You should break out one of those brushes like an archaeologist and discover things that are hidden in your home. But largely what you'll find is dismaying, because most of that stuff will end up in the trash at that point. So it was just waiting in your home to end up in the garbage. So core thing is, this is the example I have of what traditional decluttering and home organization looks like, right here. That is just recreating the supermarket aisle at your home, right? And everyone's sort of pushing this, what I would call organizational porn, in terms of, oh, this looks amazing, this is great. In the end, you're just reproducing the grocery store, in the case of the fridge here at home. So like I said, you're just bringing the store home. So what do we do? So this, again, is the traditional approach, which is look at what you have, get rid of the stuff you don't want, then put all the stuff that's sort of related together, now put it in a box or a bin or some storage solution generally, and then label it. That is the answer to decluttering traditionally. And there's a lot of popular shows, if you guys are familiar with Netflix's, I think it's Home Edit. There's a variety of different shows and YouTube channels and things of that nature that really take this approach, which generally makes sense on the surface. There's nothing wrong with this, by the way. It is one approach. I have taken a different approach, and that is to decide how I want to live and then figure out what are the things I need to have to do that and build those systems that enable me to do that. And we'll talk about some of those here in a few minutes. And then continually optimize that so that I get a routine that I habituate to and that I'm unlikely to break. And what's the point of that? I am no longer tempted to buy that thing at the end cap or the cash register at the store, or even on Amazon for that matter. I'm not interested in just clicking and getting that stuff magically delivered to my door because I know it will probably disrupt my system. And I'm now wed and happy with my system. And this will throw me off my routine. And so we're really trying to optimize not for consumption, which is what traditional approaches take. If you look at this, this is optimizing for consumption. I'm optimizing my space so I can consume maybe what I do today already or even more. So that's the approach there. What I want to do is organize around behavior, which is different fundamentally. So this is a different departure point. The DNA is in a way different. And so one of the things I've done, this is like a very simple example, so it's readable, is to say, what are all the routines I have in my life, either daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, and what are the things I need to pull those routines off to make them happen? And this is a different way to approach organizing and decluttering. And really more than anything else, avoid clutter in the first place. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. So this is the starting point. What do I actually need to pull off what I want? And these things should be aligned with my personal goals as well. This isn't a life coaching session, but if it were, we would want to make sure that this stuff is aligned, that my daily activities, my routines, my what I call rituals, recipes, and habits are aligned with the things I want to get done. Like if I want to write a book, which I'm doing right now, I'm writing a book. I want to make sure that I have the space, the lighting, whatever other elements in my lived environment that would facilitate that. And so that would be incorporated in here as an example. So this should align with your goals. I don't want my teeth rotting out, so obviously I'm going to brush my teeth regularly. But beyond the little simple stuff, what are my even bigger goals and how are they incorporated here? And how do I have the resources and space allocated to support them as well? So how can we build what I would call a healthy home or healthier home? There are 6 elements that I espouse. Being as raw and as natural as possible, and we'll talk about what that actually means. Being convenient, because you have to compete with the convenience of everything else that's being sold. And so if you're gonna mill your own wheat and make your own bread, it cannot take several days because you're just not gonna do it. It's from a comparative advantage perspective, it's probably not the best use of your time either. There can be a little bit of a difference because it might give you joy to do it. There's some other ancillary benefits, but if it is massively inconvenient or impractical, you're not gonna do it. So it's gotta be somewhat convenient. It's gotta be aesthetically pleasing because our goal is to not have that jumble in our home that we showed before, the typical pantry or bathroom counter that looks like a disaster. We don't want that. So we want to aspire to aesthetically pleasing because that is also stress reducing and psychologically beneficial. We want to be supremely sustainable, and that is there's two things with this supremely sustainable component. If you pick things that are sustainable, just by accident, it's probably not accident, but just by relationship, you will find things that are aesthetically pleasing. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll show examples of that. Because things that are made out of glass, wood, steel, metal, copper, etc., just look better. Plastic, acrylic just looks terrible after a few years, after exposure to sun and things of that nature. Whereas these other things are elemental. They're like fire. We relate to them. I also like to pick things that are highly standardized. That means they're easily replaceable and don't cost a ton. Because it's okay to splurge on something aesthetically pleasing, that's no problem at all, but in general, for my basic storage needs, don't need to do that. And I want things that are healthy. So those are the 6 sort of pillars that I look for. And I'll make this all available online, by the way, as well. So if you guys miss anything, we'll make sure. I have some cards here, so we'll make sure that this is available if you guys grab it at the end. So what do I mean by raw and natural? This goes back to that notion of we don't produce as much as we consume. We call ourselves consumers for a reason. We exist as little consumptive entities. We don't make much anymore, especially in the home. But we can, and not at a great price, either time, energy, and money-wise. In fact, it's often cheaper. So for example, in this case, I've got the coffee bean, and I've got some loose tea here. And to actually have a setup to work from coffee beans and loose tea versus tea bags and ground coffee is not much of a level, there's not a huge level of effort to go from here to a point where you can actually brew coffee or make tea. But what you miss out on is all the bad stuff we talked about before. Tea is the worst thing you can consume from a microplastics perspective and a PFAS perspective. All tea bags, even if they feel like paper, are lined with plastic. And that is to control the rate of steeping. And you can find, if you really look, you can find unmodified paper tea bags, but that is something, if you leave here and you're a big tea bag user, then look for those types of companies that produce tea bags that don't have plastic. Most of them by default do. And there's some Consumer Reports information you can easily find about that. It is the worst thing. If you were to take, say you had your delicious green tea or herbal tea in the morning out of a tea bag, the worst stuff is the plastic, the mesh plastic tea bags. That's the worst, but even the paper ones. You were to steep it, drink your tea, and we do a pee test, urine test later that day, your level of phthalates, bisphenols would have spiked, notably. And that's because the worst thing when it comes to plastics is heat and acidity. The tea has a little bit of acid, some oils as well, some fat, a little bit of fats, not quite so much as the acids, but heat applied to plastic leads to leaching. And that's what you're going to have happen. And the same thing with coffee. Use the coffee pods. That's a source of plastic as well. So the closer you can get to something in its natural state, the better. We'll talk some more about that, but in the case of food, this is ideal. So then you start going, well, maybe I'll just get some of these stainless steel steepers. Okay, I can get around the tea bags. You can actually also get your own tea bags, by the way, but I find it tough to put the stuff in there, so I just use these. You can get a coffee grinder. You can also get electric ones. I have this one just because it looks cool. It's pretty. I do use it. You do have to get used to it because you got to use a little bit of elbow grease, but you can get electric ones. I use a Chemex coffee maker just because it's very simple, very straightforward. I put the coffee that I grind in a mason jar, very simple, use a steel filter. Then I actually more recently went to just grinding it. My sister liked the coffee grinder, so she took that, then ended up with this thing that just fits right on top of the mason jar. I just leave it on. And so when I grind the coffee, just go straight in there. And then I've gotten a coffee sock, which I don't use paper filters. I can just use that fabric coffee filter and then throw it in the wash. And then I've got a better tea kettle that is easier to pour over. So the point here is that everything here is meeting those 6 criteria. It's healthier. It's raw and natural, as is the sort of topic on the slide. It is aesthetically more pleasing. It is supremely sustainable. All these things are standardized because Chemex has a bunch of knockoffs that's been around for over 100 years. So everything's easily and cheaply replaceable. But it also just looks better and is healthier. And I can kind of create a little stand or area where everything goes in a very tidy spot. So again, this is a routine. Coffee is part of our life. And so how do I incorporate it in a way that meets those 6 criteria? And what happens is I produce less waste. I'm buying raw coffee beans. I'm not buying filtered paper filters. So very little trash is produced and very little packaging of those things that are single use is involved. The only thing that I regret that we create that gets disposed of is the bags the coffee comes in. So that is unavoidable, at least right now. There's no dry goods place where I can get it close by, but so that's why we end up where we end up with a minimal amount of waste. And it's better, by the way, it's better. The other thing is, just as a complete side note, the coffee grinder, the wooden one there in the middle, right here, you can get little pepper grinders that look very similar to this. And you get the peppercorns and you put them there, it will make the best black pepper you've ever had. And you would not think that black pepper needs to be any more amazing or different, but you really can get black pepper that just tastes fundamentally different if you grind it as you need it. So just an interesting side note. So the other thing I'll just point out here, I'll go through these, is what I have is there's 3 ingredients that are raw. MCT, which is coconut oil that's been fractionated, which means some of the fats have been taken out, some white vinegar, and baking soda. So what's the point of this? This is the raw ingredient stuff again. I can use that MCT oil, and my wife does, as skin moisturizer. It works. She's a surgeon at Stanford, so she knows. She used to have her lotions and potions the whole counter was taken up by probably several $1,000s worth of stuff. And she's kind of gone down to just like 3 or 4 things that are fairly natural. MCT oil is one of them, the coconut oil. And the thing is that same coconut oil I can use to cook with, to moisturize skin, and to coat and condition cutting boards and wooden handles and everything. So it doesn't go rancid. That's why it's use the MCT fractionated oil. But the point is I can use one thing for 10 different purposes. And it's super leverageable in that way. The same thing with vinegar. It's a great cleaning agent. In fact, if you have wooden cutting boards, as an example, it's the best way. That vinegar and salt and a little bit of baking soda is a really good way to clean cutting boards in place without having to drag them to the sink. And of course, baking soda is used for all sorts of stuff, including cleaning, and it's a scouring agent. So the point is, and we have some guides around how you can use basically a handful of stuff for cleaning purposes, but the point is that a few things can do 10 things, if you will. Now, one other thing I'll just say, I didn't put it up here, is anyone hearkening back to their college days may remember Everclear or grain alcohol. It is some of the best disinfectant. At 190 proof, it pretty much kills everything. So you have a little bit of that. I don't think you'd have that also to drink. That would be a little bit scary, but it is a very cheap way to get a disinfectant. If you mix it with vinegar and a few other things, it becomes a pretty good cleaner. Not saying that you have to do that, but the point is that a few things can go a long way and take on multiple tasks in the home. So what about convenience? So here's some things that I'll put up that are able to make life easier in terms of just access. So Lazy Susans, I use glass Lazy Susans in the refrigerator so that stuff doesn't get stuck behind other things. And so I use 2 or 3 12-inch Lazy Susans that are glass. Glass does better in the fridge than metal, plastic, or wood. And so that's why I use these glass ones. You can find these on Amazon. Outside the fridge, I use wooden ones. So for soups, spices, cans, and things that are outside the spice rack, I use this type of Lazy Susan. For space saving and convenience, I will use what is a lift-up shelf. So I can have the KitchenAid, which is used for 1,000 things, as you guys may know. KitchenAids can have all sorts of attachments to them. We even have our grain mill on the KitchenAid, but it's a big beast. And so I use, these shelves come in all sorts of sizes. A shelf that simply pulls the KitchenAid up and closer to use. Makes everything just a little bit easier. The other thing is you get the same type of shelves from above. So if you've got a bunch of canned goods, items, dishes that are hard to get to, that you, as a result, will never get to, you can have these shelf modifications that come in all sorts of sizes that you can use to pull things closer to you, down and easy within reach. A few other items, I think these are more common, pull-out shelves, and they come in wire form and also full metal. I like metal because it's tough. If it does bend or anything, you can put it back into shape, or a handyman can help you do that if you need. But these things last essentially forever. And again, if it breaks or something happens and you toss it, it will get recycled. But these are all things that make life a little bit more convenient in terms of access, for sure. So here's an example of how that's used. I don't think anyone needed probably the picture to spark the imagination, but you can see here you have the Lazy Susans. I would probably add one of those pull-down shelves at the top here, just to make this stuff more accessible. Because if you're short, it probably isn't as easy to get to. So aesthetically pleasing. So this is literally the promotional page for plastic cutting boards that you can see here. And they can do all they want. It still looks ugly compared to this, which is the other photo that we had earlier. Your body almost knows which of these two things is better for it. It knows this just is unappealing in general. And the good thing with wooden cutting boards is just an example, and that's been on the news quite a bit about how there's so much microplastic shed from plastic cutting boards. But you put these away, by and large, because they don't seem like it's worth keeping out. They're ugly, especially if they're used a little bit. People like plastic cutting boards because they're light, they can be put away, they can be washed in the sink easily because you can drag them over there. Wooden cutting boards, in contrast, you can see this one is they're generally heavy, but they're okay to leave out because they're aesthetically pleasing. They look nice. Even when they've been used for 10 years, they still look generally nice. Now, if you still want the convenience, by the way, of a plastic cutting board and you like the lightness, et cetera, organic bamboo that doesn't contain any formaldehyde is a good option. Those cutting boards act like plastic in terms of lightweight, et cetera, but they don't last as long as like a maple cutting board or something along those lines. They'll still last a decent, few number of years. So again, aesthetically pleasing. This is just your standard mason jar used in the pantry. This just looks better. So now you're decanting the stuff from plastic. You're taking out, like say you got some peanuts, you bring them home and you put them in a mason jar. You're like, well, I'm just taking them from one container to another. This is true. It's a fair point. However, what this gives you is visual inventory. You know when to buy stuff. You know what it is that's in your routine. You may have 10 or 15 different types of nuts and dry goods and whatnot, and you can always see how much you have. And if you have a shelf that pulls out at home from the top and you look down, you can use a wax pencil to write on the lids what it is that's in there. If you're looking straight across as you are here, you can just obviously see what's inside those jars. Fairly straightforward. But what this does, it cuts down on waste because you're not buying the same thing 3 times because you can't see it. It also pretty much structures your consumption. You have a spot and a container for all the things you typically use on a recurring basis. And so now you have that available to you. Oh, the peanuts are running low. I'll get some more, put them in there. I have peanuts on the mind for some reason right now, but you get the point.
Are those stackable?
So you can get mason jar lids that are stackable. Okay. They're not commonly known, or known about, I guess, but you can get mason jar lids that allow you to stack jars on top of one another. They're not out of the box stackable, but it is possible. And as you know, mason jar lids, I don't have a good slide in here for this, I should have, but you can buy all sorts of lids for these jars and make them to turn into pourers, shakers, lemon squeezers. Mason jars are like the iconic American thing that does 1,000 things. And they've been around for 150 years for a reason. And sometimes people go, everyone's going overboard with mason jars. I don't think so. I think they're just part of life because they've deserved a spot in homes because they're so versatile. So I don't take anything away from them for that. Now this is a little bit different from a sustainability perspective. So this is a hotel pan. You guys familiar with these? You can find them in restaurants and stuff. It's called a hotel pan. And it's good for storage. They come in standard sizes, standard lids, standard everything. So if you lose them, you miss the lid gets lost, you can actually just buy lids on their own. So it's great from that perspective, which is what I love in terms of that supreme sustainability and standardization. You're buying things that doesn't look that bad. It's relatively cost effective, and it just works, and it stood the test of time. One of the interesting things I've done with this is twofold with hotel pans. You can use them just for storage, like in the bathroom, for knickknacks, things of that nature, that hair dryer, combs, things of that nature that you just want to keep covered and put away. But one of the things I've done in the kitchen is, this is traditionally how you'd use a hotel pan. and you can get a stand. And one of the things I've done is moved away from paper towels, just because we would just go through them like there's no tomorrow. And I simply got some rags and I made one hotel pan here, the clean cloths, and the other one, the dirty ones. So I had 2 hotel pans right next to each other. And so you pull out the clean stuff, you wipe up the counter, do whatever you need to do, the spills and whatnot, and you throw it in the other hotel pan that's the dirty. It's essentially the hamper that's really accessible right there in the kitchen. So that's a simple example of how now you're not bringing a bunch of stuff that's just going to leave your house pretty quickly, and then you're just simply washing these rags, these cotton rags. Another example, and this is actually where my bizarre sustainability journey began for myself. This is a very quirky, odd thing, but I was upset I was going through a lot of shaving foam. I don't know why, but it's Indian hair, I don't know, it was like one a week, 1 can, and I was getting frustrated. And then I got to realize how much I was spending on disposable razor blades. It was like, I think now it's like $30 for 6, like $5 a piece, and it'll last about like a week. And so, being cheap, I was a little frustrated. So I actually got a double. At first, I actually just got the soap and the brush. And I was basically doing my own lather, and I was going, this thing lasts like a year. This is bizarre, and it's better than the shaving foam. So I was hooked, and then I ended up getting the double-edged razor because I was like, oh, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to take off a few layers of skin. Turns out it's just as safe as your typical 5-blade Gillette Fusion or what have you. That's why they call them actually safety razors. That's the old name for them. And so I bought a pack of blades, 100 blades for $10, I think. Maybe it was even cheaper than that. So now I'll never have to buy a blade again in my life, basically. And so the point of this looks aesthetic, it kind of goes with those 6 principles. It's aesthetically pleasing, supremely sustainable, infinitely recyclable. All the stuff here is metal. It will never end up in landfill. And if it does, it will just rot away on its own. But the only thing is regrettable, obviously, sometimes the soap comes in plastic packaging. I have found soap that comes in paper, so that's been nice. But that's just another example. Again, talking about standardization, mason jars, hotel pans, Pyrex dishes. These always come in 3, 6, 9, and 11 cup sizes. These are made by Pyrex and also Anchor Hocking. They're also made in the U.S. if you care about that. And I get the square ones because they're stackable and they don't take up a lot of space. The round ones I've avoided. I've just moved away from them because you end up wasting space. They're hard to put away. And one of the things I do is leave these in the fridge, even if they're empty. This is where leftovers will go. This is where takeout will go. So they just have a spot in the fridge because there's always a turnover of leftovers and takeout. And I take the takeout from the plastic bin, put them in there, and this is where it ends up. And so it's storage, and also the ultimate destination is the fridge, so that's where I keep them. Instead of cluttered in some drawer, where then I'm having to find out where the lid and the container match up. Now the good thing again with these, the point around standardization is, if you lose a lid, you can buy another one. You don't have to throw away the whole thing, so that's been great with these. The other one that's a little bit odd is I really am big into ammo boxes because they're watertight, they're very tough, they have handles, and so for things that I have like knickknacks or I actually keep a whole bunch of Q-tips in here as an example. Strange, but they're very effective because it's slim, it's again airtight, so it's perfect for that type of use, and they come in standard sizes and they're fairly cost effective. The other thing are stainless steel storage containers. These are now more standardized across different manufacturers. I love these. They're probably hard to see. It's a little washed out, but they come with either a glass or clear silicone lid. And so say you have a pull-out freezer, you can look down and see what's inside the container without having to, rummage around. So this, unlike the Pyrex, which doesn't have a clear top, so you're really at the fridge level looking across and go, okay, I see that's yesterday's spaghetti. Here you can look down and say that's a frozen casserole because you can see down into it. Heritage jars and penny jars are great for the pantry as well. So I use these. There's airtight version of them. They're called Montana jars. I don't know why, slight different name. I don't know why Montana, but that's what they're called. You can actually put like chips, popcorn, things of that nature. They're airtight. And again, you can see what's in there. And so the chip clip disaster doesn't exist anymore, where you have a bunch of crumpled up bags. It just aesthetically doesn't look good. They don't keep very long because the air gets in there. So this is what I've moved to as an example. And as this display shows, it just looks better. And if I lose a jar, they're easy to replace. If I lose a lid, they're easy to replace. There's nothing ultimately special here. So healthy. We talked about this. This is actually not my fridge, but pretty close. So I use 64-ounce ball jars and 32-ounce ball jars, along with a couple other sizes. And the produce that I would not leave it loose like this. I'd put it in a ball jar. So we have a produce guide, but just as a quick tip, when you get the produce home from the store, cut it maybe in half to make it fit in the jar, but don't wash it and put it in the jar. Wash it when you're ready to use it. Lettuce will last 2 weeks when you do this. Berries will last over 10 days. You know how raspberries or blackberries will get mold within a few days? That goes away. You basically have airtight lids with these. You can get a pack of like half a dozen for $15 at Ace over here. And this will make your produce last way longer than otherwise. I don't know if you guys have already used this technique, but it's very, very effective.
What are those jars called?
Those are just mason jars.
Are they the same?
Just all the standard. Yeah, again, I actually use these mason jars, the whole point about reusability. I use them to store different supplies in the bathroom. I use them in the fridge, so they just can be used anywhere, and it's great. So these are your standard ball jars. I would say for large produce, use a 64-ounce. It's about this high. For berries and things, use a 32-ounce, cherry tomatoes, stuff like that. And then for herbs, use a 24-ounce. What I do with 24-ounce. What I do with the herbs is put about a half an inch of water on the bottom and drop like the herb in there as a bouquet. And then I close the lid loosely. I don't airtight the lid in those cases. Now, if you forget about this stuff and it's in there for a month or more, it will tell you when you open it. You will know. There would be an olfactory message. But I also use a glass Lazy Susan so that I can easily get to the stuff and nothing gets hidden back in the back. So again, this is a consumptive fridge versus a productive fridge there on the left-hand side. So a few more slides here I'll get through very quickly, and I can hang out for questions. The reason we kind of avoid as much processed foods as possible now is this Campbell's Chunky has about 7,000 milligrams of phthalates, and these are known as endocrine disruptors, carcinogens as well. If you need to take feel free. And then you look at some other items in the home. Candles are really bad, by the way. They have a lot of VOCs and other substances, including forever chemicals. The other big one are clothes. So polyester, we're realizing especially from furniture, we breathe it in and it stays in our lungs because our lungs are not used to polyester fibers and they hang out there. It's not the same level of damage as, say, asbestos, but it has similar properties in terms of the effect. It's a long-standing bioaccumulative irritant that stays in the deepest parts of our lungs because it can sneak past all the lungs' classic defenses, unlike, say, sand. So the baby bottles are the worst. The state of California is suing 3 large manufacturers right now over this very issue of BPA-related chemicals in baby bottles. So a couple quick more things, and we'll wrap up, is you don't have to go nuts and do all the things I've said in here. You can do some simple stuff, like just buy more sustainable brands that use less packaging, thinner plastic, et cetera. You can use other packaged goods that are just packaged differently and take up less space, create less clutter, or you can actually make your own stuff. So this is actually what you can do here to create dishwasher detergent. So you can use these 3 ingredients and you have some of the best highly rated dishwasher detergent at Walmart, as an example, that you can buy. That's their house brand. basically just has these 3 ingredients at the end here. And you can just do it yourself as well if you want. So the other thing I want to make sure to stress is, given the day and age we live in a lot of abundance, a lot of opportunity to experience new things, so we should consciously budget for novelty. Leave space in your home for, like for example, your fridge for different sauces, different things you want to try, because you should budget for novelty. Don't say, I'm stuck in this routine, I got to make sure I can't do anything else. Budget for the idea and the ability to experiment and experience different things, but do it consciously. And then finally, I'll just shameless plug, one of the things that we do is let folks actually send us a picture of their home, specific parts like their fridge or their pantry. We actually develop an AI analysis of what we see using AI, and then we create a plan for what they can swap out and take advantage of. So that might look like, this is actually done with AI, take a fridge, we can itemize everything that we see, and then what the good alternatives are to what's there that may be more sustainable and ultimately create less clutter. And we're writing a book. So it's something called the Plastic-Free Diet, which I'm on. So we're hoping to have that out by the middle of the year. So I'll stop there. You can also join our WhatsApp group. I have some cards here that have a QR code, and you can sign up for the WhatsApp group and some of the other information, produce guide, et cetera, using that form that the QR code takes you to. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you guys have any questions. I'll pass these out while I'm wrapping up here. Go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for the presentation and talking about these things. And I'm really interested in creating a plastic-free diet as well. I always feel very sad by this because there's a ton of PFAS on the inside of this.
Yeah.
There's not much alternative. There's not like reusable sort of to-go things that you can drop off anywhere and they can reuse it. Do you know anything of any efforts to pick that up and take it?
Sonoma County is working with stainless steel alternative, which are just basically local cycle, where you can just leave it at a Starbucks and get another one, some other another restaurant. So they are working on that, and they come with silicone lids. Yeah, really, it's very early though. I think they just launched it this year.
It's amazing. I've been thinking of it for several years now.
Yeah. Oh, and there's another question. Sorry, I think you guys may have asked around where to take certain stuff, and then I'll answer your question. TerraCycle, most manufacturers have a hidden program. So toothbrushes, razors, et cetera. Procter & Gamble as an example. If you have used your toothbrush, it's done, your razor blades, et cetera, you can actually get a free mailing label. They'll pay for the postage, and you can send it to them, and they'll recycle it. That recycling is more than what a municipal recycling facility can do, because they take the plastic apart from the metal, which most recycling services at the city level can't do that. So TerraCycle does that for most organizations. If you look at most brands, they will have it. They don't advertise it because then people might use it. But it does exist. You had a question, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So what are the top websites where we can find information how to do, homemade dishwasher detergent or creams or this type of?
Ours is one, but you can also go to EWG, that's the Environmental Working Group. And then if you like, the Environmental Working Group basically has a whole host of solutions. There's also a company called Yucca, Y-U-C-A or K-A, and it's an app, and it will tell you, like if you take a picture of shampoo or lotion or what have, it will tell you what the problems are with that, and also tell you the alternatives. So that's a really good app. Anyone else wants a card? And the other thing you can do very easily is, if you look at any of the DIY solutions, pass one more down, yeah, thanks. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, for DIY, yeah.
DIY, so the biggest DIY opportunities, and I have there you go. The biggest DIY opportunities there are in general are going to be, thanks, there you go, skincare, cosmetics, and cleaning supplies. I've personally tried them with great skepticism, because I have the belief, and still a little bit, that there's nothing that can beat industrial strength 409 or what have you. But what I've found is that for day-to-day use, white wine vinegar will Everclear and a little bit of Castile soap will do everything you need and will last forever. So I keep them in amber containers, the ones that are brown so that light can't get into them. So I keep those 3 ingredients in jars and I just mix it as needed. So I don't go to the store as much. And for day-to-day cleaning, it's perfectly fine. If I have some industrial strength mess, maybe I'll go buy something, that's super strength, but I don't really need it. I have not had to do that in the last year. My wife, who I was mentioning before, swore by the most expensive, and I noted this every time I saw what these things cost, because they're always made in France and they always cost like 2 ounces cost like $100. It's just shocking. But she was dedicated to the, I'm in middle age, we're middle aged, so you gotta, take care of your skin, into doing that type of stuff and investing in those types of products. And what she has found, she did the research behind it too, is that 3 or 4 things were perfect. Shea butter, canola, I'm sorry, what am I saying? Jojoba and coconut oil for moisturizer. And she hasn't, and then she, for like sunblock, she uses titanium oxide. And that's really all. And so we've gone from hundreds of bottles, probably not that many, maybe a couple dozen, to basically 2 or 3. And then with makeup, it's the same thing. There are clean makeup brands now, though. They're out there, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this. I do a decluttering business, and I had a question about balance between.
And sorry for that one slide then. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I totally agree. But kind of finding the balance between you want to get things organized so you put it in a plastic bin versus like if I already have it, should I use it or should I get rid of it and get something that's sustainable? Because then what I had in my home is going to go to the landfill. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so on that point, you should just keep what you have. By and large, if you already have it. Sometimes people get excited, especially around here, they got the money. So like, part of it is, it's a design decision then,
Yeah.
right? It becomes, I want my aesthetic to be different. So that's not really necessarily a sustainability decision, that's purely a design aesthetics decision. And so for the plastic bins, which they last forever, the only thing that happens with them is that they warp at the top and the lid doesn't fit right. And so if you really wanted to, you can get, like I use those hotel pans, but they only are so deep, right? So they're not really meant to replace that. You can get wooden crates that are, they're basically foot lockers, which is what we used to use before plastic bins came around. They're a little pricey though, but they essentially last forever. And they're very nice looking. But I think plastic bins, to be honest, are much more effective in general. But my goal is to not have to need plastic bins. Because what the plastic bin tells me is I've got some excess that I'm inventorying. And for certain things, they're perfectly appropriate, like Christmas decorations, right? Yeah. Sure.
Follow up if nobody else is asking. So let's say I have plastic cutting boards and stuff like that. Should I get rid of them for
That I'd punt. I'd punt those. Because the cutting board is a direct administration of plastics into you, for sure. And it's not even subtle. Like, I don't know if you ever seen a used plastic cutting board, it is ground down in the middle. And there's enough evidence now that I don't think it's too controversial. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I've heard that wooden cutting boards also harbor bacteria, and that like metal ones should be considered. What are your thoughts on that?
We've been using wood for a really long time, and we've been dying from other things at a higher rate. I mean, you should clean it. And so you do have the notion, it's an appropriate question, right? Because that's what plastic cutting board manufacturers use to sell the idea of plastic over wood, because you could throw it in the dishwasher and get it, pretty sanitized or relatively sanitized. But if you clean your cutting board and apply oil on a regular basis, there's not much bacteria bacteria harbored any more than our immune systems can typically take. Now, if you're immune compromised or something of that nature, then obviously that's something to consider. The metal cutting boards are fine. There's actually titanium cutting boards that are very popular. I have no problem with them. I actually have one. They are tough on knives, especially Japanese knives. German knives can handle them a little bit better. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment, cutting board wise. If you separate a cutting board that you cut raw meat,
Yeah, that's
you should be, or fish, you should be pretty safe in relationship to.
It's a really good point. You have two cutting boards. And we have one. One is a teak one, one's a walnut one. The walnut one is used for vegetables, and the teak one's used for everything else. The other thing is the teak is good because it has oils that resist bacteria. Most wood do, by the way, but teak especially. It really resists absorbing moisture, and it's not foolproof, but it's better, for sure. Thank you.
You mentioned TerraCycle, and then you mentioned the Yucca app. What did you mention in between?
Environmental Working Group,
EWC.
EWG.
I'm sorry.
EWG. And to be honest, what I have found best is if you go to YouTube and say, how do I make the best DIY skin moisturizer? You will find 5 different people, and I listen to all of them. We have a YouTube channel as well. We have some of the stuff. But that's where I find the real world experience versus like most articles I read that are from larger publications are like Cosmo articles that are kind of very fluffy. Whereas someone will say, I tried this and it just didn't work for me. And that's, I think, better, input. Yep.
So in the U.S., if we're only recycling about 6%, why do we even have the blue bins?
To make us feel better, to some extent. It is.
I think it's historical. I think in California, plastic used to be shipped from here to China.
Yes.
And so there was a point in collecting it, and it was all going to China. But China basically said, we don't want the plastic anymore, and so now your point is valid. Like, why are we putting all this stuff in a blue bin? It's not being recycled. But I think historically, there was a little bit of myth, but there was also some truth in that the plastic was being segregated and going somewhere.
You're 100% correct. There was a robust commodity market for plastic, and those plastic inputs were used by China. But now China, with a consumer economy, creates enough of its own that doesn't really need to use ours. And that, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they basically said no more. It was a hard decline.
Door closed.
Yeah, we're shutting down. And so then other South Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries started to take on some of the stuff. And that's where you get those pictures of clogged riverways and things of that nature in like Bangladesh and other places.
Yeah, I also find that I live in a townhouse community, 28 units. A lot of people don't even pay attention to what they throw in these things. Same thing at an office. When I was working in an office, there's all these recycle bins and compost bins, and nobody really pays attention. They just throw everything wherever they throw it. So.
That's a big issue. You're bringing up a good point. Like most people don't realize a used pizza box is not recyclable. It's not. It's compost. Yeah, it's compost. It's compost. And so we actually are working on an app that just lets you take a picture of your garbage and tells you this goes here, this goes there, this goes there. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but more so than people do today. And one of the things I've started doing is put my recycling garbage, more of the recycling, in a clear bag, so it's easier for the folks at the facility to figure out what's in there. And also put all my plastic film, like bags and packaging that's thin plastic film, into one container. It's a little bit more work, but that way that stuff messes up the machinery. So I try to take the effort on my end to do a little bit there.
Are plastic bags recyclable?
No, but it just lets them keep it out of the system.
Okay. I actually reuse them. I don't buy any trash bags.
Yeah,
Just put anything that comes in plastic bags in my trash.
yeah, that's the ideal. I don't think we get much plastic bag activity anymore, at least in my house.
California,
Yeah.
New York.
Oh, right, yeah, fair enough, yeah. Go ahead.
So I wanted to mention, I use plastic recycling, it's very limited, it's called Rigwell. Are you familiar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you mentioned your coffee bags,
Yeah,
because you can put those
in there, yep.
multi-plastic.
Yep. And most of the reason on the coffee is the coffee bags we get are mixed material. So it's aluminum and plastic, and those are tougher to recycle. So it's like the Tetra Pak cartons. One of the things to note is like, so if you guys are familiar with Piazza's, which is just down the street here, there's that expensive glass Strauss milk, which they do use. The cap is not recyclable. We talked to Strauss, they said as much, which is fine. But Clover has now come out with a completely plant-based carton. So a carton of milk does not have plastic lining, whereas most will have. In fact, this water bottle that my son brought me is aluminum, but don't ever get aluminum water bottles if you can get steel, because this is lined in plastic. Because aluminum imparts taste on anything that's in it, even water, and so they coat it in plastic to avoid that. Yeah. Yeah. So if you guys have any questions, this is a passion project for me. So you have my email. You might even have my phone number on there. You can feel free to reach out to us. Yeah. Just send us an email, and in the, if you also do this QR code, it will, if you're better emailing, you can do that. If you want to use a QR code, we'll set you up. Yeah. Either way.
How many people do you have now working on this?
In the company, there's eight people. So, you know, maybe it will be something huge one day. But right now, it just feels like the right thing to do more than anything else. And so most of the stuff are things that I've just taught myself and learned from others, obviously. It's not all, you know, just me discovering stuff. And so I'm continuing to learn, and I just want to make sure, you know, just want to say one thing real quick, is just that I did not know that there were options. And one of the other things beyond the shaving that triggered everything was I was getting upset at my wife for no good reason, because our nonstick pans are going bad during the pandemic. It's like, you're using metal on them. I know you are. And I was the one who would buy them, and they're kind of mine. She's like, I'm using your stupid wooden, you know, spoons. I promise you, you know. So it was this kind of tussle between us. And then I read, like, these things are basically disposable. On regular use, they only last 6 months to a year. I was like, no one told me that, you know, even the ceramic coated ones. And so we switched to cast iron, going, okay, this is going to be a pain. And I got the cast iron to the point where I make eggs and it doesn't stick. I was like, how do I not know this? How, like, who kept this from me? Who hid this secret, this magic? And so, you know, a lot of, like, you know, I grew up in South Carolina, and so I talked to my friends, like, oh yeah, I got my grandmother's cast iron. It's 100 years old, right? And apparently some people know, but I certainly didn't. So I've been discovering these things. Some of it's like ancient wisdom, and some of it's new stuff, right? That's just better. And so that's what it's been it's a process of discovery. Some things we should just never let go of, and because marketing has been so sophisticated, we've been taught to abandon things that maybe weren't worth abandoning. And then I fear that as the AI and things get better, our ability, like, I'm surprised most people aren't broke, because the ability to convince you to part with your money is so sophisticated now that it's hard to imagine it's easy to resist. So, yeah. So being able to push back against it is also important. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Appreciate it.